my name's Carl Deal, and I'm a filmmaker who also happens to have family on both sides of the border. And I'm here to talk about the beautiful short film Águilas with the filmmakers. And I've seen Águilas a couple of times now, and it's just an incredibly moving story about the unseen and the unheard migrants who are sort of at the center of the flashpoint for this uninformed, racist, unruly national discourse we're having about immigration in the United States. And they're too often left out of the dialogue. And this is a film that's about the hundreds of migrants who go missing in the Arizona desert every year, crossing from Mexico into the US. It's about their families, and it's about the volunteers who search for and retrieve their remains. I want to welcome the filmmakers, Kristy Guevara-Flanagan and Maite Zubiaurre. Thank you for bringing us this beautiful story.
Thank you.
So I thought, if we start out, if you could tell us what is the genesis of this film, but also how did the two of you come together to make it?
Maite and I both work and teach at UCLA. I'm in the film department and she's in the humanities. And she had spoken to me about her work with Águilas del Desierto and her work on the humanitarian crisis at the border. And I was, really intrigued and wanted to get to know this group and wanted to volunteer myself. Thought there was a very provocative short film that could be made from the work that they do, and particularly the search.
Yeah, exactly. So Kristy and I met because we were colleagues and share, I think, very similar values in regards to all things social and racial and justice and migration issues. Águilas is part of what we like to call a multi-pronged scholarly endeavor called forensic empathy. And forensic empathy looks at the tight network and rather complex network of migrant care. We like to call it ecologies of migrant care, using a term that is used by NYU, who has an initiative around it. That happens particularly all along the border, really, but particularly at the southern Arizona border. And this is not happening just by chance. Tucson is the cradle of the sanctuary movement back in the 80s, when so many Central American migrants looked for refuge in the United States. And it was actually Tucson and a particular church, the Southern Presbyterian Church, that actually helped migrants. And Tucson is a very interesting place where this tradition of politically minded people who really want to support migrants is still alive. So forensic empathy started with a scholarly monograph, co-authored scholarly monograph, but the urgency of the subject is such that, again, it's a collaborative project that we thought that we needed a different runway, more impactful, more immediate, to give visibility to the particular tragic issue of migrant death in the desert. And that's how Kristy and I started collaborating.
Okay, so right off the bat, filmmaking is all about choices, right? It's about what you leave out and what you include. And I wonder what that process was like for you, because you just gave us a lot of wonderful context for the story that you told. And that context isn't actually in it. How did you settle on making such a, and I'll call it a simple film because it's very straightforward. It's very complicated and nuanced, but how did you decide on making this simple film? Was it because of the impact?
It was just a bite-sized piece to take, to chew on, this search itself. And the film came together very quickly. Maite, we were talking about it. Maite invited me on a search, and a few days later we went. It was right before Christmas, and I gathered, one camera person. We were a very small crew, and so I didn't even, we didn't even think about it too much before starting it. And then once, the search happened, it was very clear that that was just a really special journey that would have multiple layers of meaning for many audiences. And I just thought there was something really essential about keeping to that search in this particular film. And that doesn't mean that, there can't be bigger works about all these concerns, and more in depth about Águilas, but I just felt like there was, something pretty special in just staying in this space and in this environment and on this particular journey.
At that time, I had become a volunteer of Águilas. And again, the migration issue has many, many different sides. It's very complex and polyedric, but this was just a deeply poignant story because it is also the story of migrants themselves helping migrants. And Águilas del Desierto is a group of people who are essentially workers, domestic workers, gardeners, construction workers, who work very hard through the week. And then still they have the passion and the strength and the idealism and the heroism really to devote their weekends to this mission that they have been doing for 10 years. So it's a very simple, straightforward and tight story with very powerful one. And we truly thought, okay, this needs to be told. This needs to be told in a manner, and we probably will talk more about that is not sensationalistic in nature, that just is sober, straightforward, and thought-provoking.
It was not an obvious choice not to make this a story solely about the heroic volunteers who give up their weekends. It was very much about them, but it was also about, all these other people who are part of our daily conversations here, and nobody knows anything about them or who they are, and their voices aren't part of the conversation. But you made them part of the conversation. And so I wanted to ask you about the opening montage and the montage at the end, where you have the voices of family members who are asking for help, and they're identifying their missing family members. They're describing them and when they crossed, where they crossed, when they were last heard of. Those voices, they carry so much weight, and they make the missing people real. Just little details in it, and their worry, and sort of the formality of the pleas, and the hope in it, and also there's this feeling of resignation, like that it's the worst, right? So
Yeah.
I don't know, how did you come across those voices and then decide to include them and use them the way that you did?
It was always really important to include the story of the migrants themselves in some capacity, as you mentioned. That was always a part of what we wanted to bring to the project. And so we weren't entirely sure how to do that. Of course, seeing the artifacts that are left behind in the desert is a powerful way to connect and see them, what's rendered invisible so often in our conversation, our political conversation. And to have the Águilas describe a little bit about their journey as well. But we always knew we wanted like some other way to connect to them. And a lot of these stories that you hear in our film, these little snippets, were posted on the Águilas website, the Facebook page. This is how people are reaching out to them with these pleas for help. And also, I think for audiences to connect emotionally to what is being said in the short snippets and everything that, just the power of those pleas and the loss and the multitude of it and the range of people, where they're coming from, the ages and the stories that we're not hearing behind them.
It is a round story. These voices close the documentary, but they also open it up again, because though this particular search and rescue mission is closed, there are more calls coming in and more people looking for their families and many more migrants tragically dying. So it's a documentary again that is closed, but then again, tragically and widely open.
Yeah, and Los Águilas are going to be back the next weekend, and that's what you leave us with. It's very moving. It's horrific, really. And in just the shots of the desert were so simple but so powerful. You get a sense for the terrain and the brutality of the terrain, throughout the day. And I wonder if we could talk just a little bit, if you guys could talk about the sort of the trends and the policies that are creating sort of riskier, less opportunities to safely cross the border. What's happening now? Is this a new day or not in immigration policy?
Unfortunately, migration policies that are literally and willfully killing people continue in place. They started in 1994 with a set of policies called prevention through deterrence that basically fortified and militarized urban crossing borders, therefore forcing migrants to look for crossing points that are much more dangerous and remote. And this was not done naively, as we can all imagine. That was done with a particular goal of deterring migrants through death. Politicians knew full well that migrants would die in the effort. And it doesn't really matter if we have Republicans in the government or Democrats. Things don't change migration-wise. The totalitarian regimes that are in place then and now, migration-wise, are still killing people. So does one documentary change the situation? No. But the goal of Águilas ultimately is to raise awareness, but mostly to have Washington listen to this plea.
I like to think about documentaries as sort of the coming together point for art and for journalism and also for activism. And, I guess any film can impact how we feel about a particular subject matter. I mean, you get involved emotionally but films can also deliberately raise awareness and lead to some kind of action. And so I wonder how it is that you think about the possibilities for this film to make a concrete impact on a border policy that seems to be creating, more risk and leading to more deaths and more danger. How do you envision using this film to address that? And how can we help?
Okay.
Well, I think another goal, of course, of the film is to raise awareness just in the general population that may have not had direct or don't think they have sort of a direct connection to people who are migrating currently. For those audiences, they can begin to really reflect on the great risks that migrants take to come to this country, and that clearly they are not making those decisions lightly, and that there are, a group of people that are really actively trying to prevent death, prevent loss, and bring closure to the families.
Both Kristy and I are professors and scholars, and of course we think about the younger generations. And I think it's absolutely fundamental that young people learn about this all over the place and all over the United States and also internationally, because of course migration is a universal phenomenon. I'm from Spain, so I always say here the sand kills, back in my country the water kills, the Mediterranean kills. I always say that the desert combines radical visibility with unforgivable invisibility, because you walk in the desert and you run into human skulls, you stumble upon human bones. It couldn't be more visible. Jason De Leon, our colleague, has this great book called The Land of Open Graves. It is a land of open graves that we refuse to see. How can you combine visibility and invisibility? And how can you normalize the death of fellow beings on our land?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe I would wonder if the way you described people who might need to see this film is, I think maybe among those are elected officials and policymakers who think that way, whose thinking might be impacted and turned around. So, you know, maybe something that those of us who are watching this discussion right now could do is urge their elected representatives to watch this film. How does one see this film? Where can we go?
So the film is available on the New Yorker website, and it's also streaming currently on PBS's POV. And I should say, you know, people can also volunteer for Águilas del Desierto themselves. They welcome volunteers. You can find them on their website, and it's a very eye-opening experience and a direct way to become involved. And they're a wonderful model, and that's another reason that we made the film, is because they are a beautiful model of activism and led by migrants themselves.
It's wonderful. Kristy, let me ask you one other thing as a filmmaker. When you set out to do this, when you went out on the search and while you were making the film, did anything surprise you? You know, what did you learn while you were making this film?
Well, it was pretty shocking just to, I've never seen human remains before. So that, of course, was what impacted me the most and has haunted me and has been sort of the guiding post for making this film, to find a way to communicate that to other audiences. And I just was really swept away by the spirit of Águilas themselves and how they operate, how inviting they are to volunteers, but how thorough they are and committed, so deeply committed to their journey. And it was just a pleasure being with them and getting to know them. So it was two things simultaneously, right? Like really life-changing what I saw, and positive, optimistic with the work that the Águilas continue to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess it keeps idealism certainly alive. And also, I think Águilas taught us just by their attitude when they faced death, what the tone of the documentary should be. We always like to call it the sober dignity with which Águilas goes out into the desert and confronts death one weekend after the other for 10 years, with no histrionics, knowing full well what they're doing, amassing forensic knowledge just by running into dead bodies all over again. And that somber dignity, I think, is what inspired the style of our documentary.
Sober dignity. Well, Kristy and Maite, thank you so much for making this beautiful film. I hope everybody sees it, and I hope that it makes a difference. It's enlightened me, I can say that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. A pleasure.
Pleasure speaking with you.